Sort of the different arguments about why junk food might become eligible for regulation,
yes.
based on what we talked about in class.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, it's long been thought that what you put in your mouth is entirely a function of your choice and your right, and that we ought not to invade your choice about what you put in your body any more than we invade your choice about what to put on your body, namely your clothing, or with whom you associate and share your body, for example. But increasingly, the obesity sort of disaster that is struck as a plague around the globe has suggested that obesity and overeating, a function, of course, in large part of junk food, has become a function of public health and welfare. And that on the much more traditional principle that you can regulate what harms others, it may be legitimate for lawmakers to concern themselves with what people put in their bodies. Not because it harms them, that would be to pursue a different principle, namely the paternalist principle, but because ultimately the fatter they get, the more they develop health conditions that implicate others' well-being. Obesity causes all sorts of health impediments that ultimately may weigh heavy on the public trust, to the extent that taxpayers have to foot the bill for the health costs of those who make themselves, by overeating and by eating junk food, most typically obese. The state may indeed, on harm principle grounds, regulate the intake of people's food. Now, of course, it would be a different reason to regulate the eating of junk food and overeating generally on the basis that it's harmful to the person, him or herself. And that would be to suggest that paternalism might be legitimate, and that the state might indeed legitimately pursue the good of the person over his own assessment of the good that he has. That's always, of course, very controversial. To suggest that the state should substitute its judgment of what's good for an individual for the judgment of the individual himself is a dangerous proposition. And in general, we ultimately think that what it means to be an autonomous person is to have the right to use our bodies as we will and to ingest what we will, even when it may not be a particularly wise choice in light of our health and welfare. So that's a much more controversial basis upon which to regulate junk food. Far more traditional is the harm principle basis, that we are starting to harm others by our overeating. Far more controversial is the notion that the state should substitute its judgment for our own. To the extent that we're offended by the kind of obesity we see around us, that would be yet a third basis for thinking that obesity could be regulated. But typically, if people aren't harming themselves or harming others by their behavior, the fact that they're offending others isn't a basis for curbing their liberty either. So two bases for invading someone's liberty with regard to what he or she eats, and the harm principle is becoming a prominent one in our society today.
Don't you think that state should interfere to this private sphere and to regulate, maybe?
Well, I mean, it depends on how much you think people ought to have liberty even to harm themselves, right? In America, it's very common for people to think that drugs ought to be legalized because you have a right to make a choice, even to harm yourself through substance abuse. You have a right to wear clothes that may be demeaning or debasing to you. Many people choose clothes that we wouldn't choose for them, and yet we think they have a right to choose them. So it's really when private choices become publicly harmful that we feel fully entitled to regulate those choices. But precisely because obesity has become such an epidemic, precisely because in America more than 30% of the population is not just overweight but obese, and those have tremendous implications for children and for the public trust that foots the bills, we're there. We're at the point at which what people eat seems to be of consequence to others quite directly.
If you were a congresswoman, would you prohibit junk food and McDonald's especially?
I don't know whether I would prohibit it yet, but I can certainly imagine embracing legislation that curbed it, that limited it. There's a popular movement afoot today to bar junk food from public schools. The notion that we would be feeding our children who are too young to choose for themselves rationally what to put in their bodies, that we would be feeding them junk food and contributing to childhood obesity, strikes me as outrageous. And so the movement to curb junk food availability in public schools strikes me as precisely the kind of thing a legislator ought to pursue. Whether you would, instead of prohibiting junk food, whether you would perhaps encourage the development of healthy food alternatives, both within operations like McDonald's and as viable alternatives. So what you do is you'd legislatively encourage, through tax breaks, through subsidies, the development of food chains that credibly provide healthy and safe alternatives in food. That strikes me as another legislative option that preserves choice in a very meaningful way by providing alternatives to what our junk food restaurants otherwise pump out ad nauseum.
And now it's impossible.
And now, well, I mean, I don't know that it's impossible. Everybody understands that, overeating has become a serious health issue for Americans, for Australians, for Europeans, spread the globe around. And pretty soon lawmakers are going to have to ask whether they're using their power in the way that encourages the good of society. Prohibition would be one solution, but it's the most radical. It may be that there are lesser solutions that are less intrusive, but that ultimately serve the same goal.
But it's a similar situation with smoking, yes?
It is a similar situation with smoking, and notice we didn't prohibit smoking. And we have curbed smoking just enormously in America. I mean, it's just a tiny fraction of the population that used to smoke that now smokes. And we did that through public education, through a really serious campaign of public education. If legislators use their power to educate the public about the health consequences of junk food as ferociously as they use their power against tobacco and the tobacco industry, we may solve the problem that way without having to regulate what people put in their bodies directly.
And what do you think about rights of smokers?
Oh, I don't know. The right to, that's a really obvious one where secondhand smoke is clearly a violation of another's ability to stay healthy and offends in a way that's rather unique. It's an assault to the senses. So I've never been one to think that smokers had rights to smoke, because that's to say that people have rights to harm others. I don't think you have a right to harm others. And as soon as junk food constitutes the harming of another as opposed to just yourself, it does indeed become something that seems to me to be eligible for regulation.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hurd.
You're welcome. Thank you.